But thank you for making it anyways. I'm Stanford, co-founder and CEO of Initia. I'm sure you guys have heard a little bit about Initia, hopefully. If not, I'm happy to give a little bit of an introduction itself. But yeah, I guess like the homework assignment that I was assigned was why and what went wrong with the multi-chain world. And it's kind of the thing that we spend a lot of time at Initia thinking about how can we kind of solve some of these many problems. And so I think there's a few things to talk about. Maybe we can talk about product architecture, we can talk about infrastructure, we can talk about the incentives itself. But for today, I would just like to talk a little bit about like the incentives itself and then like kind of how we solve the problem. So I guess like the simple answer, which is here, is interoperability and incentivization is how we at Initia kind of really like to think about this multi-chain problem. What we simply mean by this is for interoperability, we really want applications to be able to cross-pollinate. And that doesn't necessarily mean cross-pollinating its users, but also cross-pollinating the assets within each different type of application that they exist on. And so what we kind of mean by this, and what I like to give the formal definition of it to be, is to facilitate sequential interactions with different types of applications built on different chains with some simple type of UX, right? So if you kind of really think about your multi-chain experience right now, you're kind of walking back and forth between different applications, don't really know like where the bridge page is, or maybe you have to go to the bridge, maybe you have to use some bridge aggregator, maybe you have to use some DEX aggregator. It's like quite difficult if you're not like very familiar with the space as well, right? Like I could probably say, okay, what's the easiest way to get from Solana right now to Sui or some other chain? And probably the majority of people would not be able to answer what is the most efficient path to do so. And that's simply because, one, you have to use aggregators, and then you need some sort of meta aggregator to aggregate these assets themselves as well. Another thing is like, if you're a very heavy Solana user or you're like a very heavy Ethereum user and you want to try out a new ecosystem, I think a lot of people are put off by downloading a new wallet, right? And trying a whole new experience, like handling the private keys. Is the private key format the same on Ethereum versus some other chain? Why can't I just use my existing MetaMask or like my existing Rabby wallet to sign a transaction there? And I think a lot of wallets right now are doing a really good job of trying to like increase their coverage for all these chains, but there's always going to be new chains. There's always going to be new infrastructure. And so how do we make a new ecosystem or a new framework that allows, from the infrastructure layer, or like the chain infrastructure layer, for one wallet to sign multiple transactions on different types of chains itself. And then I guess like, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there's like optimized routing. So if you kind of think about moving even something as simple as USDC across different types of chains, you kind of have to figure out, am I going to move USDC through CCTP? If I'm going to use CCTP, for example, on Bungie or like Li-Fi right now, it works up to 1 million USDC. I don't know if you guys tried, but actually if you try sending on Bungie on the front end more than 1 million USDC, the path does not appear. So you kind of have to break up those transactions if you're sending more than 1 million. For the average user, this is probably not a problem, but there exist whales and things like that. So yeah, and these are like very weird edge cases that you would only know if you use the application multiple times, right? Like the average user is not going to know this, but somebody who does want to transfer this, you have to kind of like go on the front end and enter 1 million versus like 99999, or versus like 2 million or whatever. And you kind of see, oh, the outputs are really weird. They're all different. And then you kind of try this sequentially. So how do we handle those types of like error cases or like edge cases in a way that makes it easy for the user, right? The user shouldn't have to care about this, but you do have to care about this if you're trying to send more than that limit. And then at the same time, there's like some sort of judgment to be made about the slippage itself, how fast the finality is. If you actually try to send, for example, 1.9 million USDC from Ethereum to like Arbitrum or something like that, you can actually send it through a cross, and it will give you a very good rate, but it will take 120 minutes to settle. And so that's probably something not good as well, even though you get the best slippage or reduce the amount of slippage. And I guess like the last thing we kind of try to really focus on is specifically reducing choice overload. So in a world where there's like a million different types of interoperability protocols such as bridges, there's like a million different types of DA layers, like as a user or like even as a builder, like what should you use, right? They're all kind of the same thing. They're all kind of fungible. There might be some tech benefits, but for the average end user, it's like very difficult to make that decision. And so actually, we think reducing some of that choice overload is good for the user. Yeah. And so this is something maybe you have seen before, maybe you have not seen before. It's called the Yerkes-Dodson law. Kind of basically outlines that, people perform well, results come out well, the more stimulus they have up to a fixed point, right? And after that fixed point, basically you're like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do. There's just too much information, you're like extremely stressed. And so performance drops dramatically. And this is the same kind of like graph you would see with builders who are trying to choose where to build on, like how to interact with their users, how much, like, should I be building on this for its like community? Should I be building on here for its like interoperability, etc.? There's a lot of choices, right? So if you look at the dotted line graph, it's a simple task. Like choosing a VM is pretty easy, right? It's like a simple task. The more stimulus you get, the more performance that increases. For something that's a little bit difficult, like figuring out the best way to route an asset from one chain to another, you have to look at like both the swap rates. If you're swapping for different types of assets as you bridge, you have to choose the bridge you want. You have to choose maybe the aggregator that aggregates those bridges, or maybe you want an aggregator that aggregates all the aggregators. And so like this is very difficult to choose, and I would say probably most of the builders are somewhere around that middle point, but there's a lot of people who are in the very end and they have no idea. And so a lot of times it comes down to like very poor choice decisions or like poor decision making when there's too many choices. And so we want to reduce that and simplify it. And how we do this specifically at Initia, I guess I'll talk about this first. There's like 50 types of different USDC. I'm not sure if you guys know this application. If you know it, come up to me after this and I'll give you a prize. But in no fault is this the application's fault, in my opinion, right? I think it's the infrastructure, underlying infrastructure's fault for allowing these things to happen, right? So you have WUSDC, you have like a bunch of WUSDCs that are denominated for ETH, BNB, Sol, Ethereum, ARB. And then you look at like the little underlying description on the second line, which is its origin chain, right? But some is like WUSDC, some are USDC, like is this native USDC? Is this native USDC, for example, issued on Arbitrum? Is this like USDC that's been bridged through the Arbitrum optimistic bridge and then bridged to this new protocol? Like where is the origin of this asset, right? And this is the biggest problem, right? It's not just like simply wrapped USDC, it's that if you follow more than two paths, use more than one bridge, you get this very weird thing where there's too many wrap standards. And so we want to remove all this. There's too many Ws. And how we kind of do this is canonicalize the best in class for each specific asset or each specific layer of the tech stack. And so what we kind of do specifically is we've made like very distinct choices on what we think have the best standards, right? And this includes things like Layer 0 and IBC for bridging, Celestia for DA, Skip API for routing. We remove wrap token standards by enforcing a hub and spoke model, so you go down and then back up in a multi-chain world. And then we've also built very interesting things such as like the wallet widget or the bridge widget. So what the wallet widget does is it allows you to sign a bunch of different transactions with whatever wallet you're comfortable with, whether it's like a Solana wallet, a Cosmos wallet, the Initia native wallet, an Ethereum wallet. And so that's only one part of the problem though. So if you kind of think about if you're able to sign transactions, that doesn't necessarily mean if you look in your wallet that you'll see the tokens, right? And so what we've done specifically for each application and allow them to integrate on their front end is to build a small little widget. They connect their wallet with whichever wallet they're familiar with, and then they're able to see all the Initia assets and all the assets that are on the rollups that are built on top of Initia. And so you're able to see in one place all the assets I have and kind of get that feeling that, I'm in one world. And how we kind of envision this is, if you look at iPhone, if you guys are familiar with using iPhone, there's a bunch of applications. Imagine if every application you used had to be done on a different phone, right? Like that's the current feeling of using applications on different chains, right? It should be one phone, one underlying infrastructure. You have multiple different types of applications, and you're able to interact seamlessly across all these applications. That's kind of like the Web 2 vision or like Web 2 comparison that we like to make. And I think a lot of people actually misunderstand this as like we will forever use a specific infrastructure, right? And that's not true. We want to build an architecture that's flexible, it's modular, we're a modular project in some sense, and have this plug and play type of architecture, right? So if in the future, ZKs become the gold standard, and I do believe in the future as we make more process with ZKs, then we can remove the optimistic rollups and implement ZK rollups. If there's a better bridge or like, intents become the next thing, and like for some reason, whatever reason, existing bridge doesn't support intents, then we will move to an intents-based bridging. And this is obviously dependent on like the ecosystem, the type of projects that are building on top of it, and like the needs of each individual project. And so what we like to talk about is backwards compatibility with existing infrastructure, such as signing with MetaMask and existing wallets. The second part, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is incentivization. I think there's maybe an underlying or like unspoken rule to not talk about money and people wanting to make money. I think it should be the opposite. You should think about what everybody is trying to do. A lot of people are moved by incentives, right? And so how can you drive these incentives in a very free world, in a very, let's say, almost code is law world, although not everybody believes that. How can you drive this in this open and permissionless environment using incentives to move people in the way that you want as a protocol or as a specific project? And so you want to give the end user a financial reason probably to care about the success of the greater multi-chain world, right? Like, why do I really care about Ethereum? Or like, why do I really care about the rollups, right? Probably because for a lot of people, they have some sort of financial stake in it, whether they're a builder on top of it, whether they hold a lot of ETH, etc. We want to give users a reason to actually use the product themselves as they normally do, but also have an incentive for the greater ecosystem to succeed. So you want to allow this cross-pollination. You want to make sure that, okay, if I'm just a perp trader, and then there's like some other project that is like SocialFi related, if the SocialFi product does really well, and I'm like part of the greater ecosystem, I should partake in some part of that upside, right? And so we want to make sure everybody has a stake in the success of the underlying infrastructure itself. The second is like design a sustainable economic framework that considers the interactions of decision makers. And what this means is, in like this open environment, everybody will kind of move towards basically optimizing their own personal, let's say, portfolio or their own personal risk framework, right? You shouldn't expect somebody to just do something just because they're a very nice person. And so when you take that into account, there's a lot of people to actually think about, right? Like, what does the L1 want? What does the L1 stakers want? What do the L2 users want? What do like the applications user wants? What do the teams that run these L2s want, right? There are a lot of different parties, and you have to kind of consider the difference in interests of all of them. And so in some sense, they might not be always exactly the same in the end, but you can kind of align them to move in the same direction and say like the overlying L1 or like the overlying infrastructure and ecosystem kind of views this as the final goal. Everybody should be roughly moving in that direction, even if it's like zigzag path instead of a straight path. And then I guess like we want to encourage productive use of incentives and recycle within the ecosystem, right? If you kind of look at ecosystem incentives by a lot of other foundations and places, they give these incentives for using the protocol, or like maybe even farming the protocols that are built on top of the L1 itself. But what does that really do? Like, of course, in the short term, you probably build some TVL, maybe build some volume, and hopefully the end goal out of these multiple different paths that could happen is that it gets a lot of actual natural attraction. But in a lot of cases, users just are very mercenary, right? Like, you get the rewards, you farm them, you sell them, you go to the next ecosystem, right? So you want to think about mechanisms that actually allow users to continue using the incentives that they receive within the ecosystem, right? And it should be profitable for them to do so, or at least attractive for them to do so. And so that's what we've been thinking a lot about at Initia, how we can make sure that all the applications that are built as roll-ups, or I guess like application chains that are built as roll-ups, actually receive the benefits of the success of each and every individual application. And the last part, I guess, is like relatively simple: remove middlemen. If you see in some of these like grant programs, what happens is the foundation gives grants to these projects, and I think that's good. But like, who are really the people that made the chain successful, or like made the project successful? It's the end users, right? To a large degree, obviously, the people who built the apps are very important as well. But what we want to make sure is that at least a large portion of these initial incentives go to the end users. And so we want to remove the middlemen, remove any potential of like, for example, a malicious team to just hold the assets in their treasury, right, and never give it back to the users. And this has actually happened. And so we want to enforce direct incentives to the end user. And that's, I guess, what we describe as Initia VIP. It's our little economic framework for making sure that everybody is aligned within the ecosystem. It wouldn't be a keynote without me shilling my own project, so I'll do a little bit of shilling. What we do for VIP is, this is the total init token supply. You kind of think of it as like a jar of M&Ms. We allocate 10% to this VIP program, or like vested interest program. This is subject to change. This is just an example, 10%. What we do is we stream this across some fixed amount of time. And you can think of this as similar to validated rewards. It's streamed over a very long period of time, let's say 30 years or something like that. What we do is, for each month, the L1 stakers participate in a gauge vote. And what this means is that they decide which applications will get incentives. It could be a mixture of applications, it could be one application, but in general, they kind of vote and we say, okay, I'm a voter, I think like this application, let's say GMX, has made the most or largest contribution to the success of the ecosystem thus far. And so maybe you want to vote for GMX. And so based on this voting, the stream of rewards are divided across different types of minitias or different types of projects that are built on top of the underlying infrastructure. If you take a look at just one of these cases, let's say 30% of the rewards are streamed to this yellow M&M, how we decide to actually distribute to the end users is the split between the init balances and the KPIs set by the L2s themselves. And so from the L1's perspective, you kind of want to think, okay, I want to incentivize people to actually use my native token, have use cases for it, but kind of realize the limitations in the fact that like I'm not the best person as an L1 staker to decide what is the key defining metric. And so you want to incentivize init balances to some degree, and then you leave the rest of the incentivization to the L2 to decide. And this is decided by some L2 set KPI that they make public on chain. They submit a proxy contract, and then users are able to basically query that against their own activity and see how well they actually did within each specific epoch. For the KPIs themselves, it can be anything that can be tracked, right? We expect different types of projects to be built. So for maybe a lending market, maybe you want to incentivize borrows. For a perps dex, maybe you want to incentivize volume that's traded. Although I think that's washable, so maybe not the best example. Minting for NFT, how active you're actually involved, or maybe what are the interactions between the NFTs themselves. In a game, maybe let's say Monopoly, you have on-chain Monopoly. Maybe you want to incentivize the number of roles in a game, and maybe that costs a fixed amount of resources each role. But all of these are decided by the L2s or the projects themselves because they know the project best. There's a twist though. VIP rewards are distributed in the form of ES-init, and this kind of goes back to what I was talking a little bit earlier about. If you just give users the incentives right away, there will be a lot of mercenary capital, right? So you want to encourage long-term usage of the protocol. You want to encourage recycling within the ecosystem. And so how they actually unlock this ES-init, which is called short form for escrowed init, is they must maintain either their init balances over time and kind of maintain their TVO over time within each specific minutia, or continue their activity on the L2s anyways. So you actually kind of basically filter out to just the good users, right? The users who would have used your application normally anyways, they'll maintain these KPIs because they would have used the application. So a simple example is, let's say this month in VIP, the rewards are a total of 1 million ES-init, and that the gauge votes are split 30-30, 40%. And so each individual minutia receives 300,000, 300,000, 400,000 init, ES-init respectively. And we can walk through a quick example of how minutia C, which received 400,000 rewards, kind of can distribute these to its users, right? And in this specific case, for the sake of calculation, we assume 10 uniform users. And so minutia C distributes these rewards based on perp volume. Let's say it's a perp dex or something like that. Maybe, I don't know, GMX or whatever. So in week 1, this user does $1 million in volume, and they have init balance of 50, and they receive 10,000 ES-init. So these ES-inits are not transferable immediately. They're actually vested over, let's say, 52 weeks or let's say 26 weeks. So in the first week, they receive that position or like that reward position, but they're not able to unlock it immediately. If you look in week 2, let's say they maintain that volume. What happens is that they receive 1/52 of that total position. Week 3, let's say, for some reason they got a little bit busy with life, or the user got liquidated or something like that, and you've only been able to do half that volume. So for each of the positions from week 1 and week 2, they receive half that amount that they would normally receive, corresponding to half the amount of KPI that they actually satisfied in that week. For week 4, let's say they recovered, added a little bit more collateral to their trading positions, and now they're trading $1 million a month or a week. They get back to the original amount. So in week 1, their position was 10,000 ES-init. That's divided by 52, so they get roughly 192 in it for the first week's position, 192 for the second week's position, and then 196 for the third week's position, which is 1/52nd of the 5,000 rewards that they received. And so what this kind of like lets you do from the L1's perspective is that validators, they're incentivized, right? Because staking governance actually has a purpose. It gives rewards to end users as well as the minitias that are building on it. And people have reason to actually vote and be active voters within governance. And then on average, validator commissions will increase. For L1 stakers themselves, staking and voting on VIP gauge votes becomes valuable for the L2 actors, right? As an L2, as a project, I probably want to bring as much incentives to my project as possible. So we will probably want to incentivize users to actually vote for my L2, and maybe there's some sort of model that can be built around there. And so it's also good for L1 stakers because there's more ES in it that's soft locked on various different L2 applications. In some sense, you're reducing some of that like external pressure and bringing actual like demand for the actual underlying asset itself. The L2s themselves, they benefit for specifically Initia operators and application teams. It's like an extra stream of rewards, right? It's like subsidizing either your marketing budget or subsidizing some form of user incentives that you would not normally be able to give. And then it gives you a way of monetization of your product before actually launching your native token, right? I think if you've talked to VCs or other people, they're like, okay, so what's your model, right? What is the model of this token? Like, how do you make money or make revenue as a product? Well, this is one of the ways without even thinking about your native token. So you have an additional stream of incentives. For the L2 users themselves, I think it's pretty simple. You would use the product normally, but now on top of that, you get a little bit more of incentive in the actual ecosystem itself. And you can take these rewards and actually, move them to a different L2 or like move to a different application itself. And so there's this, let's say, virtuous cycle of momentum. Incentivization leads to increased usage, which leads to increased incentivization. And this keeps going on and on. Yeah, maybe that was a lot of information overload, but that's kind of how we really envision Initia and like the ecosystems and how Initia interacts with the rest of the products that are building on top of the underlying infrastructure. Thank you.